The rain turned the field hospital into a clattering church of metal and canvas, where the sky wept through the gaps and the lantern oil hissed like distant serpents. The first case of the night came as a discharge of sparks, a child's cry muffled by a damp cloth, and the heavy thud of footsteps that belonged to men who no longer walked. The scent of ether hung in the air, sharp and medicinal, with a tang of copper that lingered somewhere between courage and fear. In the corner, the pale glow of a single lantern crawled along faded walls, and a name hung above the doorway like a tired oath: C109. Case C109. Dr. Elias Thorne steadied his steel-tipped needle and pressed his lips into a thin line. He was not tall, not imposing in the way a siege engine is. He was the kind of man whose presence felt more like a hinge than a bolt. Quiet and precise, the hand you trust to hold a patient steady while the world tilts. His eyes, the color of old storms, studied the patient's face, already pale with the surrender that follows the moment a limb meets the surgeon's saw. The air carried a mix of damp wool, scorched linen, and the faint sweetness of dried resin from the lantern wick. A murmur rose from the crowd around the operating table, not quite words, more like a rhythm of fear that settled into the bones of the men and women who watched. The soldier was a figure, wrapped in an innumerable scar of uniforms and clandestine stories. His hair clung to his forehead with sweat, his lips pressed tight as if to squeeze out the sound of pain before it could take root. He wore a coat that was 2 sizes too big, a trick to hide a frame that looked smaller beneath the cloth, a frame that could vanish into the folds of a battlefield and remain unseen, a thing the war enjoyed turning into a myth whenever it pleased. The arm, severed with a whetted blade, and the steady hand of necessity, lay in a field-dressed heap of cloth and bandages. Thorne's tools lay in a crescent around him, the instrument of mercy and the instrument of violence, both equally honest in their claim to necessity. The nurse, a woman named Mara, who carried the smell of rain and laundry sheets all at once, moved at a measured pace, her hands gloved in stained leather. She did not rush. The man who had given orders to push through this work did not allow rushing. The patient's breathing came in a ragged pattern that sounded like pebbles sliding down a wooden ramp. The room smelled of antiseptic, sure, but also of something else: warm leather, old soap. The faint sour bite of fear that makes the throat tight and the heart clench. Thorne spoke, not loudly, but with that quiet authority that only a man who spent long nights in the space between life and death could master. We'll begin with a precise incision, then align the stumps. We'll forego a tourniquet if we can, he said, his voice low and careful, the words measured as if they were to be weighed on a surgeon's scale. The patient's eyes, which were not visible beneath bandages, might have been looking anywhere at nothing, and yet Thorne could feel the weight of their gaze, an unspoken plea not to fail, not to degrade the moment with unnecessary flourish. The moment of revelation came not as a sudden knife strike, but as a slow unveiling, a second act that arrived with the patient's muffled cry and a rustle of cloth. The arm was amputated cleanly, the bone glided away with a respectful ease, and the bandages were applied with the gentle pressure of a mother smoothing a child's blanket. It was during this quiet moment, when the room was suddenly too bright with the lantern and too quiet with breath, that Thorne noticed something that did not belong to the typical ledger of injuries. The chest, area beneath the bound cloth and the rolled blanket, held a shape that did not align with the expected anatomy of a man's torso. It was not something visible at first, not something the field bloodstains would readily reveal to any casual observer. Yet there was an unmistakable roundness, a softness under the thick wool that suggested a female anatomy hidden beneath, perhaps a woman's body partially concealed by the uniform and the bandages. The discovery did not feel like a triumph. It felt like a fracture of the room's air, a crack that let cold air into a warm chamber and made Thorne's breath hitch. "Stand back, Mara," he said almost to himself, though his words carried to the nurse's ears as clearly as the hiss of the lamp. "We'll need to clear any tremor of the room." He spoke softly, but the tone carried a weight that suggested he knew the kind of truth that could alter a life as surely as a blade could alter a limb. The patient, who, as the hours wore down into night, became a human constellation of tension and fear, urged with a tremor in a voice that was not quite male and not quite female to speak more softly, to reveal less. "Please," the man pleaded, his words fracturing the dense, humid air. "Please, doctor, not here, not now. If you must know, let me tell you later. Don't tell them. The words were not just a request. They were a shield against the war's rumor mill, against the men who would whisper about the disguise of a soldier, about girl or boy, about what a war would demand of the body and the mind when the rifles grow quiet and the river runs cold. Thorne looked up from the patient's side, his eyes meeting Mara's for a measure of a second, as if to pass between them a syllable of understanding. The truth, if spoken in the wrong moment, could become a weapon in the wrong hands. Later, he said, though it was not a simple compliance but a careful, moral decision to defer a moment that could become a weapon. We will talk later. The words did not erase the fear from the patient's face, but they offered the patient a soft absolution, a promise that the truth would not be weaponized in that moment, not in that space. The surgery continued with a surgeon's meticulous choreography. Thorne's hands moved with a musician's precision. Each cut, each tie, each suture carried with it a memory of previous nights, when the world had seemed black and sound, and the lamp's flame burned as if it were a small sun. The patient's breath became the room's metronome. The whisper of linen against skin spoke of quiet endurance. The clink of glass and the muffled thunder of distant guns provided an auditory chorus that reminded the men in the room of the war's constant, unrelenting presence. The hours bled into a still midnight when the last stitch cooled into a pale, clean seam. The patient lay still, the chest under the bandages rising and falling with a rhythm that did not quite belong to a single body. Thorne sat back, letting the room settle, letting the mind adjust to the idea that the battlefield could sometimes reveal the most intimate truths at the edge of a surgical blade. Mara removed her gloves with a soft, papery whisper, and the lantern's flame flickered a moment as if bowing to the weight of what had happened. Case C-109, Mara murmured. Not to any living soul, but to the memory of the case itself, as though it could hold a lawyer's argument or a judge's verdict within its fabric. The name, carved into a ledger and whispered in the same breath that carried the doctor's vow, held a strange magic in the dim room. The patient's voice, now more muffled with anesthesia, or perhaps simply weary with the day's burden, found its way to a whispered confession that tasted of bile and fear. "I asked you to keep me hidden," the patient said, the words almost a sigh, a breath that trembled on the edge of silence. "I asked you to keep the world from knowing who I am." Thorne did not answer with a flat denial or an outright denial. He answered with a careful human reply, the reply of a man who understood what it meant to be hidden, to be protected, to be judged by the body that carried the world's expectations. "The world is not a kind place," he said, choosing his words as if they were bandages to be laid gently over raw nerves. "But I am a keeper of the truth's mercy, not its blunt blade." The patient's breathing slowed, the tremor settling into the chest like a ship dropping anchor. The moment passed, and the night settled into the quiet of the hospital's careful endurance. Thorne did not promise a future he could not guarantee. He offered instead a promise of memory, memory tempered by restraint, memory lacquered with responsibility. As dawn broke over a sky bruised with smoke and salt air, Thorne kept his promise to Mara and to the patient, though the secret pressed like a weight inside his chest. The patient's voice no longer reached beyond the ceiling's rough plaster. The patient's name remained tangled with bandages and the war's endless demands. The case file was written with careful handwriting, each stroke a kind of apology to an unseen truth. 109. In the days that followed, Thorne moved through the hospital with the same slow, deliberate pace that a chess player uses to map his moves. He attended to the amputations of new soldiers as if they were prayers, each limb a sentence spoken to the war's memory, each patient a reflection of the cost of making a nation whole again. But in the back of his mind, a thread tugged at him, an insistence that the truth about C-109 was not merely a medical curiosity, but a human story that refused to stay silent forever. The war dragged on, and with it came the cadence of more surgeries, more losses, more voices that begged for mercy. Thorne listened to them all, the quiet patient who whispered about a lover lost, the mother whose son's leg had been torn away beneath a tree, the old man who spoke of a future that would never come. And as he listened, he learned to separate the needs of the living from the weight of the truth he bore in his own chest, like a loaded cannon whose fuse was always lit. He found himself thinking of a portrait he once saw in a makeshift hospital chapel. A wooden frame, a man's stern face, eyes that seemed to measure every life that passed through this place. The portrait spoke to him sometimes, a silent judge that reminded him of the delicate line between silence and confession. The thought of bearing such a truth for 40 years pressed on him with the unyielding patience of a river-carving stone. 40 years. The phrase was a long, brutal thing, a measure of time that could either destroy a man or redeem him through the act of finally telling the rest of the world what had happened within the field's tight embrace. The story of C-109 did not stay within the confines of the hospital's walls. It began to slip into the town's conversations, to whisper among the tavern tables, where farmers spoke of every war rumor with a mouthful of ale and a careful glance toward the door. It traveled through letters that traveled on horseback, through the slow, careful droning of the telegraph's Morse, to a distant city where a young physician of medical history read it, not as a tale of gore, but as a record of what medicine could and could not do to the human heart in the presence of the moral eye. Yet Thorne did not rush to unveil the truth. Each day turned another page in the ledger's history. Each evening tightened a thread around his conscience. The patient's voice, once a clear, urgent note, drifted into a private memory, something he kept polished in the workshop of his mind, like a surgeon's razors kept honed and ready for the moment the blade might be drawn again. He did not rehearse what he would say, not to anyone, not even to himself in the quiet of the night. He rehearsed the fear of the world's judgment, the fear of his own capacity for mercy to become a betrayal, the fear of harm to a secret that could shatter a life if uttered aloud. 40 years pressed on his shoulders with the uniform weight of gravestones. He had grown old in the presence of this one memory, this single confession that would never be spoken aloud while his voice trembled and his hands learned to move more slowly. The war had passed. The world had rotated on its stubborn axis. And Thorne, the doctor who had once wielded a scalpel with the certainty of a man who believed he could mend the broken pieces of a life, found himself facing a different kind of surgery, the delicate operation of revealing a truth without destroying the world, that had allowed a lie to flourish in the name of safety. There were moments when the memory flickered back to the surface with the stubborn heat of a spark that refuses to die. A rainstorm on a spring night, sound of dripping water on the lintels, the wheel of a cart creaking in the street, the sigh of a patient as the blindfold was removed to reveal a hidden truth that the doctor had to judge how to guard, and the patient's whispered plea, a request that still begged for silence. He remembered the person beneath the bandages, the voice that did not belong to the expected gender, the stories that would have been left to vanish if he had spoken then. It was a memory that would become a key if he ever chose to use it, and then the world found a way to force the door of his conscience. The city's archives, a place where old maps and old papers gathered like dust and secrets, announced a new interest in cases of disguise and the hidden bodies of soldiers who had fought under false identities. A doctor of history came prowling through the city with a careful gait, carrying a pen that might become a sword, and a mind that valued truth over comfort. The doctor requested to speak with Thorne, and the request arrived not with a polite letter, but as a formal inquiry of a kind of moral forensic. Evidence, the sort of inquiry that promised to bring to light things that few wished to hear, but many knew existed. Thorne recognized the approach. The historian's curiosity had a way of turning memory into a public spectacle, a courtroom in which the past would be judged by the present. He was not gullible. He did not imagine that a single conversation could unravel 4 decades of guarded silence. Yet something else stirred within him, an old stubborn hunger to unearth the truth, to see if the person who wore a disguise would still exist once the disguise was removed in the open daylight of history. The historian appeared one late afternoon as a silhouette against the hospital's pale windows. She introduced herself with a soft, respectful tone that did not pretend to know more than it did, asking questions not with accusation, but with curiosity. Her name was Dr. Miriam Calder, a scholar whose eyes sparkled with the bright light of a mind that loved puzzles as much as people. She spoke to Thorne about the case that had haunted both their lifetimes, using the phrase C-109 with the reverence of a mathematician reciting a constant. "I'm not here to pry into old wounds," she said, her voice carrying the quiet gravity of someone who believed that truth deserves daylight, even when it burns. I'm here to understand the ethics of withholding and the weight of memory. The war was cruel, but memory can be crueler if we let it lie. She folded her hands, the knuckles pale with effort, and waited for his answer, not demanding, simply inviting. Thorne did not refuse her, but he did not grant her the full confession either. He offered her a seat in the shade of a porch that faced the hospital's garden, where the air carried the scent of damp earth after rain and the quiet, patient sound of leaves brushing against each other in a soft wind. He spoke in measured, careful sentences, the kind of speech a surgeon offers when he wants to convey gravity without sensationalism. "The patient under C-109, he began, letting the phrase hang between them, as if it were a blade that might be turned toward a different target, was a person who, for reasons I could not pretend to understand in his or her moment of need, chose to hide behind a soldier's identity. The operation, you know, as part of C-109 was necessary. The concealment that followed was not something I can defend in a court of public opinion. But I intend to tell the truth to those who deserve it." He paused, letting the memory settle in the room like a patient's breath after chest surgery. There is a difference between preserving life and preserving a lie that protects a life in danger of harm. I chose life perhaps at the cost of truth. Dr. Calder's eyes were thoughtful, and her question did not emerge as an accusation, but as a method of navigating the problem's moral geometry. "And 40 years?" she asked almost to herself. "Why now?" Thorne's answer was a whisper that felt like stepping into a cold corridor after a long day. 40 years is a long night. The dawn might be late, but it is still dawn. He looked away toward the garden's edging, where a sparrow hopped along a stone, testing each inch of sunlight as though counting it toward a ledger balance. "I kept the secret because I believed the world would not understand the courage required to survive a war, while keeping one's true identity unexposed. I believed that the truth would do more harm than good, that it would erase the one act of mercy performed in the operation's hour. I was wrong, perhaps, but I was also a man who swore to do no further harm." Calder's expression softened. She did not push, not yet. Instead, she asked a question that would become the session's turning point. "If you tell me, and if the record is true, what will you tell the public? That the war hid the truth of who lies behind the uniform? That the healer was forced to become a guard, a gatekeeper?" Thorne's eyes met hers, and in that brief alignment, the patient's name, whatever it was, whatever it would become, passed between them like an unspoken treaty. "I will tell them this," he replied, with a voice that had once cut through fear and would now cut through denial. "That there are times when mercy must outrun certainty, and that sometimes the most difficult confession is the one a doctor makes to the doctor, inside his own chest. If there is a public benefit to this truth, I will yield it. If not, I will carry it until the day I die." The historian left with a courteous nod and a bundle of pages bound in a worn ribbon, pages that would become a manuscript later titled simply, "The Case of C-109." In the following weeks, Thorne's life grew quieter in the hospital corridors, as though he had begun to remove parts of his own anatomy that no longer served him. He walked with a slower grace, spoke with shorter syllables, and listened more intently to the whispers of those who had survived, bearing their own stories of concealment and revelation as if they were wounds that refused to heal. Yet even as he prepared to speak to the world, his mind remained haunted by the patient whose name could not be spoken aloud without inviting storms. The patient's fear, the patient's plea for silence, and the doctor's own vow to guard the memory. These three strands formed a cord that tightened around his chest, a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between truth and mercy. There came a turning moment, not a clang of trumpets, but a slow morning when the air smelled of wet earth, and the light fell through the hospital's ceiling with the patient, now Zora in his memory, the name that he had learned to breathe around in the private diaries he kept under the bed's creaky boards. Zora, the patient disguised as a soldier, the patient who bore a woman's life inside a man's uniform, the patient who asked him, in a voice that trembled with fear and longing, to keep silent. 40 years later, a letter arrived, carried by a courier, whose boots bore the dust of the road and whose eyes held a certain quiet insistence. The letter was addressed to Thorne, but it was not from a stranger. It was from Zora's own daughter, a woman named Leela, who had grown up hearing only fragments of a grandfather who died without the world ever knowing the truth about his life. Lila had learned the story not from the mouth of her father's generation, but from the pages of a family Bible, from the corners of old photographs tucked into a drawer where the light never reached, from a rumor that kept resurfacing like a tide that would not sleep. The daughter's letter spoke plainly, but with the gentleness of someone who understood fear and respect for the dead. She wrote that she had found a ledger in which the initials E.T. stood for a name she believed belonged to the doctor, who kept the truth a secret for 40 years. She asked for a meeting, not to pry but to hear the truth, to understand the moral consequences of silence, and to decide how to tell her own child what life looked like in a world where the body's private truth could become a weapon in a public struggle. Thorne, who had spent his life measuring the world by a surgeon's scale, realized that the time had come for him to step into the light of the daylight that truth requires. The city's courthouse and the hospital's quiet halls waited, with the old doctors and younger scholars watching with interest and caution. The historian Calder had already prepared a provisional manuscript that would, she hoped, treat the matter with the compassion both memory and science deserve. The moment of revelation, when it came, did not arrive like a thunderclap but like a careful, deliberate turning of a key in a lock that had refused to be opened for decades. Thorne invited Lila to the hospital garden and asked her to bring any letters, diaries or photographs that might help connect the memory with the present. The air carried the scent of damp earth and lime tree blossoms. There was a distant murmur of bees, and the day's sunlight, pale and patient, filtered through the leaves in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Lila arrived with a satchel full of brittle papers and a single photograph that showed a man in uniform whose eyes carried an unspoken gravity, the eyes that Thorne remembered from a night when the moon glowed pale over a field hospital and a patient lay still as the truth waited to be born. In the garden, the conversation commenced as a careful negotiation between a granddaughter who had spent years nurturing the memory of a hidden life and a doctor who had spent a life trying to mend what war had broken. The dialogue was measured, carefully chosen and pushed forward by a shared desire for mercy rather than the raw appetite for truth. They spoke of the operation that had given a soldier a new life. They spoke of the moment when the body's privacy was breached, not by a sexual act, but by the necessity of healing, and of the fear that such a breach could become a weapon against a person's dignity. "I found this photograph," Lila said, her voice almost a whisper, as if she were afraid the camera lens might capture more than her words. "My grandmother told me stories about a man who wore a uniform to hide who he truly was, who bore a crown of fear to protect his body's secret. The man in the picture never spoke to me about that part of his life, and I never asked. But I want to know what happened to him after the war, and what happened to the truth that he kept hidden." Thorne's fingers brushed the edge of the ledger's cover, where the word C109 was carved into the leather with a careful chiseling, as if the letters themselves were patient enough to hold a confession. He opened to a page that bore the date of the operation, the night when the arm was amputated, and the truth began its dangerous, slow emergence. "The operation was necessary," he began, choosing his words with the exactitude a surgeon uses when setting a bone. "As you know, the war demanded more than unity. It demanded a certain kind of honesty about the state of a soldier's body. The patient, your grandmother, your kin, was a person who wore a disguise to fight, a disguise that allowed them to stand in a line where violence rules without breaking. The injury was real, the surgery necessary, and the bandages were, in their own way, a veil that kept the truth from harming the living until the time was right." Lila listened, her eyes tracing the lines of the ledger and the photograph, as if the two were a single thread that had become unbound. She asked questions, not with accusation, but with a kind of quiet insistence that grew as the story unfolded. She asked about the nurse who had sheltered the patient's secret, about the pain that must have followed the discovery, about the fear that mocked the patient's courage with every breath drawn beneath the bandage. Thorne answered, not with bravado but with a careful, almost clinical honesty. He spoke of the moment when a bandage was raised, not to reveal a body for vanity or perverse curiosity, but to understand what healing had required, the recognition that a life had to be protected, even if its truth might fracture a community's sense of order. He spoke of the moral heavy lift that came when a doctor must decide whether to reveal a person's gender, in a world that demanded conformity as a sign of strength. He spoke of the burden of memory and of the price a single kept secret might exact on future generations. The dialogue, as Thorne and Lila spoke, carried the weight of a courtroom's gravity and the tenderness of a mother's memory. It was not a single clash of axes, but a careful weaving of threads that eventually formed something new, a tapestry that could bear some light without shattering the lives it sought to honor. The two spoke for hours, the garden's air growing cooler as evening settled, the birds' evening songs gliding through the branches like a chorus of witnesses. By the time the garden's shadows lengthened, the truth, like a patient ghost, began to take shape as something more than a rumor. It was not an accusation against the memory of the patient, nor a condemnation of a doctor who had chosen mercy. It was a narrative that explained why secrecy was sometimes the only way to keep the living safe. The grandmother's life, as it turned out, was not a reflection of shame, but a testament to the courage that survived under cover of a uniform's cloth. The doctor's memory, in accepting this, found its own mercy and its own absolution. The final act of this revelation was not a thunderclap, but a gentle turning of the page, a decision to release a truth that would not necessarily heal all wounds, but might help a family breathe a little more easily. Thorne chose to entrust the public record with the balanced truth that a soldier had fought under disguise, that a doctor had performed the necessary surgery, and that a patient had endured fear and pain, while a physician had chosen mercy over exposure in the heat of a war's night. He did not promise a revolutionary reckoning, nor did he pretend the memory would ever become easy. He did promise, though, to permit the memory to exist openly, so that future generations could understand the ways in which war forces the body to carry both injuries and truths that do not fit neatly into the world's categories. The public record would reflect a humanity that refused to surrender to the easy narratives of heroism or shame. It would tell of a doctor who chose not to sensationalize a life that risked ruin, and a patient who had learned the dangerous but sometimes necessary art of loving themselves enough to survive. That night, Thorne walked the hospital corridors with his own memory, finally settling into a pace that felt, after 40 years, almost like a normal heartbeat, the steady, reliable thump that told a man he still lived. The air smelled of the hospital's quiet labor, linen, iodine, and the distant rustle of a nurse adjusting a curtain to keep the patient warm. He moved with the slow deliberation of someone who had spent a lifetime practicing how to hold the air steady around other people's fear. In his pocket lay the ledger's aged pages, their edges softened by the touch of many hands across many years. The memory matured, no longer a secret to be kept, but a truth to be recognized for what it asked of the living, to acknowledge the line between what saves and what reveals, between the medic's oath to heal and the patient's plea for silence. The case C-109's truth did not burn the village or turn a city into ashes. It did not become a symbol of scandal or a sentence of shame. It became instead a record of mercy, of the quiet courage of those who endured, and of the duty that binds the healer to the patient, even when the world would rather forget that there was a time when such mercy was a brave decision and not a crime. In the end, the story's weight did not lie in the act that had begun as a surgical necessity, amputating a soldier's arm, but in the act of keeping a life intact when the world would demand it break. The 40-year silence, once a chain, became a bridge that connected a patient's fragile hidden truth to a family's need to see themselves clearly in the light of history. The doctor's final act was not to reveal all, but to reveal enough to allow mercy to flourish in the bones of memory, and to remind us that some wounds do not heal in private, but travel into the daylight, where they can be studied, understood, and finally loved for what they were, a person's way of surviving a world that demanded more than one life could spare. And so, in the quiet that follows a life lived tethered to a truth, the memory of C-109 rests not as accusation, but as testimony. The doctor, aging and thoughtful, writes a last line in his private ledger. Not a confession of crime, but a note of forgiveness, his own, for keeping a secret that, while heavy as iron, had become a spark that could light a path for those who would come after. The memory remains, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Mercy sometimes requires silence, not to punish a person, but to protect them. And truth, when finally spoken, must be told with care so that a life, lived under the veil of fear, might at last be seen clearly, in the soft light of an honest dawn. The ending is not triumphant in the sense of victory, but it is complete in the sense that a life, both the patient's and the doctor's, has found its necessary place within the larger story of a war's pain and the quiet courage that endures in the aftermath. The case C-109 is closed in the public record, but it lives in the memory of a granddaughter who learned to tell the truth with tenderness, in the journals of a physician who learned to bear a truth that would have broken him, and in a field hospital where mercy and duty stood side by side like two old friends who know how to survive by choosing the right path for the living. And in the end, perhaps that is the most human thing of all, a secret kept, a truth spoken at last, and a life made a little larger by the willingness to endure, to forgive, and to tell the story without selling the memory to fear. The thread remains, a line drawn through time, connecting a field hospital's night of iron and rain to a granddaughter's quiet, stubborn need to know, and to a doctor's aging hands that learned at last